It's late. The streets of Rome are almost silent, except for the soft shuffling of sandals against stone and the distant sound of a torch cracking in the night wind. Somewhere deep in the shadows of the city, a man is being led through the forum, his hands bound, his tunic torn and dusted with the weight of fear. He does not cry out. He does not resist. He simply walks, shoulders heavy with the knowledge that this night will be his last. But what truly haunts him isn't the idea of death. It's the way Rome punishes those who betray her. Treason in Rome, after all, was not merely a crime. It was a curse sustained so deep that the body, the soul, even the memory of man could be erased from history itself. This is not a story about emperors or glorious victories in battle. This is not about noble speeches in the Senate or triumphs in golden chariots. No, this story lies in the corners, the forgotten alleys behind marble temples, the quiet whispers between slaves, the dread in the eyes of men who once had everything and lost it in a single accusation. In ancient Rome, loyalty to the Republic, or later, the emperor, was not optional. It was demanded, and if it ever faltered, even for a moment, the punishment was swift, brutal, and carefully designed to send a message that echoed for generations. And yet, what counted as treason? That question alone could seal your fate. Was it speaking out in the Senate too boldly? Was it hiding gold during a time of war? Was it falling asleep during a guard shift on the Palatine Hill? Or is it simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, while your enemies whispered lies into powerful ears? The answer, in most cases, didn't matter. Once the suspicion took root, truth became irrelevant. What followed was a journey into a system that knew exactly how to break a man, publicly, painfully, and permanently. At the center of this story is a man named Gaius Livius Vero. He was once a soldier, later a minor official in the grain office, and eventually a quiet presence in the outer chambers of the Senate. He wasn't famous. He didn't lead legions or write grand laws. But one day, he was accused of conspiring against the emperor. No trial, no defense, just a letter read aloud and a nod from someone in power. And from that moment on, Gaius was no longer a man. He was a warning. People often imagine Roman punishments as swift and cold, a blade, a cross, a pit. But for treason, things were different. Rome believed that betrayers should not just die. They should disappear. Their names scratched off stones, their homes seized, their families shamed, their memories chased from every corner of the city. It wasn't just execution. It was erasure. Damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. For Gaius, it began with silence. His friends stopped speaking his name. His neighbors closed their doors. Even the slave who once served him wine now looked through him like he wasn't there. Then came the chains, then the prison, and as he sat in the dark cell beneath the Tullianum, the oldest prison in Rome, he realized that he would never again see the sky. But even this wasn't the worst of it. The worst came later, when the Senate voted on his sentence, not for justice, but for fear. In those days, the methods of punishment for traitors were meant to stir dread. Some were thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, a sharp cliff on the Capitoline Hill reserved for traitors. Others were sewn into sacks with wild animals, dogs, snakes, monkeys, and thrown into the river. Some were beaten to death with rods in complete silence, because the law forbade a Roman citizen from being executed without a trial, so they simply avoided calling it that. The laws were slippery, the hand behind them even more so, but the most terrifying punishments weren't always physical. They were psychological. To be declared a traitor was to lose your identity. Children of the condemned were barred from holding office. Wives were forced to remarry in shame or live in exile. Houses were marked. Statues were pulled down. Even the most loyal citizens walked carefully around the subject, afraid that even speaking a condemned man's name might link them to his fate. And still, people spoke in secret. Whispers filled the taverns and the markets. Did you hear about Gaius? They say he was meeting with exiles across the sea. No, he insulted the emperor's statue. It was a mix-up. He wasn't even in the city that day. The truth didn't matter anymore. The sentence had already begun. As the guards dragged him through the forum that night, Gaius didn't cry out because he knew there was no one left to hear him. His home had already been sealed, his name scratched off rolls. His family, what little he had, refused to claim him. The punishment hadn't started at the prison. It had started the moment someone powerful decided he was guilty. Everything else was ceremony. But Gaius wasn't the only one. Rome had a long memory when it came to betrayal. Centuries earlier, there was Marcus Manlius, a hero who had once saved the city from a Gallic invasion. Later, he was accused of plotting against the Republic, and for that, he too was thrown from the Tarpeian Rock. His name was erased, his deeds forgotten. The Rock did not care about past heroism. It only cared about obedience. Even emperors were not safe. Caligula, Nero, Commodus, each ruled like gods until the Senate or the Praetorian Guard decided they were no longer fit. Then they were assassinated, declared enemies of the state, and their images destroyed. The difference was they had once held the power to punish, and when they fell, the cruelty they used was turned back on them with equal force. That balance between power and punishment, loyalty and betrayal, was what made Roman treason so terrifying. It could strike anyone. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, noble or unknown. It didn't matter if you were guilty or innocent. All that mattered was whether someone whispered your name in the wrong room at the wrong time. As Gaius stood before the Senate's silent stone chamber, surrounded by shadows and watched by those too afraid to intervene, he understood something that even most Romans didn't dare say aloud. Treason was not always about actions. Sometimes it was just about being inconvenient. And Rome knew exactly what to do with inconvenient people. Now, the torchlight flickers in the distance. Gaius is still alive for now, but the vote has been cast. The punishment decided. The sentence, something older than the laws, older than the emperors, awaits him just beyond the doors. And as they open and the guards step forward, we're left wondering, what exactly did he do? What truth lies buried beneath all the silence? And more importantly, what will they do to him next? That answer, as with many things in Rome, is far more chilling than you think. They didn't tell Gaius where they were taking him. The guards, clad in the dull armor of the city cohort, didn't speak. Their hands were firm, their steps in rhythm, like they'd done this many times before. The silence around them wasn't natural. It was the kind of silence that spreads when people know something awful is happening and no one dares to look. Windows were shut, torches dimmed. Even the dogs that normally barked at strangers on the street were quiet tonight. Gaius wasn't shackled like a criminal. That, oddly, gave him less comfort, not more. His hands were tied loosely with a cloth, not iron. His feet weren't bound. There was no parade, no crowd jeering or spitting. This wasn't a public punishment. It was quieter, colder. When Rome wanted to make a spectacle, it opened the arena gates and shouted. But when Rome wanted to erase someone, it worked in shadows. They moved down narrow paths, past columns and temples that had stood for centuries. The city was ancient, but it pulsed with quiet dread tonight. The Forum, where senators once debated the future of the Republic, felt like a tomb. Somewhere in the distance, water trickled from a broken fountain. Every echo of a footstep made Gaius flinch. Every statue seemed to watch. He tried to remember the last day he felt like a citizen. Not just a body passing through the streets, but a Roman. It might have been weeks ago, maybe months. The shift had been slow. First, a friend avoiding his gaze. Then a clerk losing a document he clearly remembered handing in. Then the whispers. Not open accusations. Rome didn't need those. Just rumors that piled like dust. That was how it started. That was how it always started. The building they reached was low and heavy, tucked beside a collapsed arch. It looked like nothing, just another forgotten corner of the city. But the air changed the moment they passed through the stone archway. Inside, it smelled of damp earth and something metallic like rust or blood. Torches flickered in wall sconces. There were no windows, just stone and silence. One of the guards finally spoke, not to Gaius, but to a man sitting behind a desk. The man wore a simple tunic and carried no weapon, but the look in his eyes was colder than steel. He glanced up only briefly, then nodded. "Cell 3, he said simply. Gaius didn't resist. What was there to resist now? They led him down a narrow hallway where the walls dripped with condensation. Behind some of the doors, he heard breathing, whispers, a cough, but no names, no voices. It was like everyone had agreed to forget who they were. When the door to his cell opened, it groaned like it hadn't moved in years. Inside, there was a stone bench, a patch of straw, and a single torch mounted high where no one could reach it. The door shut behind him. No lock clicked. It didn't need to. The door was thick, the walls thicker. He sat on the bench. At first, he tried to count how long the silence lasted. 1 breath, 2, 10. Then he lost track. Time was slippery in a place like this. He didn't know if it was night or morning. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Sometimes, the torch above him hissed and sparked, and he'd flinch like a child. But no one came. Then, at some point, a day, 2, the man from the desk came in. Not a guard, not a judge, just a man with ink-stained fingers and a scroll under his arm. "You are accused of speaking treason," the man said calmly, "of mocking the image of the emperor, of spreading disloyal thoughts." Gaius said nothing. He learned by now that words could be twisted. The man looked up. "Do you deny it?" Still, Gaius didn't answer. The man sighed, as if he were tired of this part. "The Senate has ruled. By a narrow vote, you are to receive private judgment. You will not be executed publicly. You will not be remembered. The penalty is exile of the body and erasure of the name." Gaius finally looked at him. "Then why not kill me?" The man rolled the scroll. "Death is not always the worst punishment. Sometimes it is memory." And with that, he left. The door closed. Again, no lock. Just stone and finality. But somewhere deep inside him, something still refused to die. It wasn't hope. Not exactly. It was something older. A question. What if they were wrong? Because Rome, for all its might, made mistakes. It was a city of ambition and blood, and sometimes the blade swung in the wrong direction. Sometimes the innocent were buried beside the guilty. And sometimes, just sometimes, someone found a way to survive. He remembered a story his grandfather once told him, a tale of a man named Lucius who had been accused of plotting to poison a magistrate. He was innocent, but his accuser was powerful. Before he could be sentenced, Lucius vanished. Years later, under a new emperor, his name was cleared, his family restored. But the years he spent hiding in the countryside were a slow death all their own. Gaius wondered if he'd have that chance. If someone, somewhere, might speak for him. If a forgotten friend might step forward. But hope was dangerous. Rome didn't reward hope. It punished it. On the 3rd day, or what he guessed was the 3rd, the guards returned. This time, they carried a black cloak. They gave no explanation, just gestured for him to put it on. When he hesitated, one of them stepped forward and said, almost gently, "It's time." As they led him out of the cell, Gaius noticed something strange. There was no crowd, no noise, just the sound of his own breath and the footsteps of the guards. They weren't taking him to a gallows or an arena. They were going underground. Through winding tunnels, they walked for what felt like miles. The air grew colder, more still. And then, suddenly, they reached a door unlike any he'd seen. It was made of thick bronze, covered in symbols he didn't recognize. One of the guards knocked 3 times. The door opened, and what Gaius saw beyond it was not what he expected. It wasn't a cell. It wasn't a chamber of death. It was something else, something ancient, something buried. And in that moment, before stepping through the threshold, Gaius realized this was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of something far more strange and far more dangerous. The room beyond the bronze door was dimly lit, and the air hung heavy with the scent of earth, oil, and old stone. It wasn't a torture chamber. It wasn't even a cell. It felt like a sanctuary, but not the comforting kind. More like a sacred space twisted by secrecy. The walls were carved with faded Latin inscriptions, words that once held authority, now barely legible under layers of dust. A single torch flickered in a bracket near the entrance, casting long, stretching shadows across the chamber. The guards did not follow Gaius in. One of them placed a hand on his shoulder briefly, not roughly, but with weight, as if to say, "This is where your life ends, and something else begins." Then the bronze door closed behind him with a slow grind. He was alone again, but not entirely. From the far end of the room, a voice called out. Calm, familiar in its tone, but unfamiliar in its source. You're not the first to come here, the voice said. Gaius turned. A man stepped from the darkness, his figure thin, his face shrouded by a hood. He walked like someone who had spent too long underground, his steps careful, deliberate. You are Gaius Livius Vero, the man continued, and you've been accused of treason, but not judged in full view. That means something. Gaius frowned. You speak as though you already know everything. The man didn't smile, but there was something close to it in the way he looked up. I know what Rome does to men like you, and I know that when they bring someone here, it's because they want him erased, not martyred. They don't want a story. They want silence. Gaius stepped forward slowly, unsure if this was a trap, a test, or something else entirely. What is this place? The man looked around the chamber, then said softly, a place Rome pretends doesn't exist. It's called the Red Vault. It's where they send the condemned who can't be killed publicly because they know too much or because their death would raise more questions than it silences. Gaius said nothing for a moment. His heart was pounding now, not with fear, but with a strange alertness. He was supposed to have been dead, forgotten. Yet here he stood. The man gestured toward a bench near the wall. Sit. I'll explain what happens next. Gaius sat, not out of obedience, but because his legs ached from standing in silence for days. The bench was cold. The man began again, his voice slow and even, like someone used to telling long stories. Treason in Rome isn't always about betrayal. Sometimes it's political, sometimes personal, sometimes accidental. But the punishment must always be the same, or appear to be. Rome survives because it makes examples. It thrives on fear. That's why they throw men off cliffs, why they beat senators to death behind closed doors, why they erase names from marble. And this place? Gaius asked. This place, the man said, is for those whose death must be unspoken. It's the quiet solution. Gaius narrowed his eyes. So am I dead, then? Am I to rot here? Not rot, the man said. You're already dead to the world above. Your name will not be spoken again. But there's a different fate awaiting you, if you want it. Gaius studied the man carefully. There was something strange in his calmness, something unsettling in how comfortable he was among the shadows. What fate? The man tilted his head. There's a network here beneath Rome, hidden ancient, older than the Senate, older than even the Republic. It protects some, punishes others. It remembers the forgotten. Gaius almost laughed. A secret society for ghosts? The man didn't flinch. Not ghosts. Witnesses. Rome only tells the stories it wants people to remember. But underneath, there are other stories. The ones they fear. And sometimes, the only way to protect the truth is to bury the one who knows it. Gaius leaned back slightly. His thoughts spun. None of this made sense. But then again, nothing had made sense since the moment he was arrested. Why me? He asked finally. The man paused, as if weighing his answer. Because someone above believed you were dangerous. But someone else believes you're useful. And if you want to survive, if you want to live even after death, you'll need to decide what kind of man you want to be. Gaius lowered his eyes. I didn't commit treason. The man nodded. Maybe not. But in Rome, innocence has never been a shield. Truth is a luxury for those who write the laws, not those crushed beneath them. Silence hung in the room again. The torch sputtered. Gaius didn't speak for a long time. Then he said softly, What happens now? The man turned toward a narrow staircase, carved into the stone. That depends on whether you walk up those stairs. What's at the top? Gaius asked. Your next life, the man replied. A hidden life. You'll live in the shadows. You'll learn how Rome works from the inside out. And one day, maybe you'll understand why they were so afraid of you. Gaius hesitated. He had spent his life believing in Rome, the order of it, the weight of its laws, the pride of its people. But now, in the quiet depths beneath it all, he saw a different truth. One that was older, darker, more real. He rose slowly, his knees stiff, his back sore, but there was still strength in him. Enough, at least, to walk. He followed the man toward the stairs. At the base, the man stopped and looked back. When you take this step, there's no returning. You won't be Gaius Livius Vero anymore. That name is already dust. What you become is up to you. Gaius stared at the steps. They spiraled upward into pitch black. No torch, no guide, just stone and darkness and the unknown. But something inside him, some ember not yet crushed, moved. He stepped onto the first stair. Above, Rome continued as always. Citizens bargained in markets. Priests gave offerings at temples. Senators bickered under golden domes. No one knew that Gaius still lived. No one even asked. The city had moved on, as it always did. Quickly, without remorse. But in the quiet below, in the dark passageways beneath the marble and dust, something had shifted. A condemned man had risen, and those who had tried to erase him might soon wish they had finished the job. The stairs creaked beneath Gaius' feet, not from rot or wear, but from age. Each step was a whisper from the past, worn smooth by the countless condemned who had walked them before him. As he climbed, his hand traced the wall beside him, using the stone to steady himself. The torchlight from the chamber below faded quickly, swallowed by the dark. For a long while, there was only the sound of his breathing and the slow scrape of leather on stone. Up ahead, the tunnel turned. Faint light appeared at the top of the stairs, bluish, like moonlight filtered through smoke. Gaius paused there, heart thudding in his chest. Whatever lay ahead wasn't part of the world he had known, and yet there was no turning back. He was already lost to the streets of Rome. The question now wasn't whether he would live, but whether his life would mean anything in the silence that followed his erasure. When he reached the top of the stairs, the path opened into a wide, low-ceilinged corridor. The walls were carved with unfamiliar marks, some letters, other symbols he couldn't place. They looked ancient, older than Latin, older than even Etruscan. The man in the hood was waiting for him again, standing beside a wooden door reinforced with black iron. "You're through the first gate," he said. Gaius swallowed. "What's next?" "A test," the man replied, "but not the kind with questions. Here, we don't measure knowledge. We measure silence." He opened the door and gestured for Gaius to enter. Inside was a small chamber lit by oil lamps and clay bowls. In the center of the room sat an elderly woman, her back straight despite her years. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were clear and sharp. Around her neck hung a strip of worn leather, marked with a symbol Gaius didn't recognize, a crescent inside a broken circle. She said nothing as he entered, only gestured to the ground in front of her. Gaius knelt. For several long moments, they said nothing. Then the woman finally spoke, her voice like dry leaves shifting on marble. "You were named Gaius," she said. "Now you are unnamed. Do you understand?" Gaius nodded slowly. "You have no past," she continued. "You have no family. You have no debts, no loyalties, no name. All that you were, Rome has already destroyed. Now you must learn what remains." Gaius looked up. "Why?" She tilted her head. "Because there are things in this world Rome cannot name. Secrets too dangerous to be spoken in the Senate. Truths too sharp to survive the laws. You were thrown away, but that does not mean you are useless. Here, in the quiet, we gather the ones who listen." Gaius thought of the day they took him, the way no one looked him in the eye, the way his name vanished from the records. He thought of how easily the city forgot. "I want to know why," he said quietly. The old woman's eyes narrowed. "Why they chose you?" He nodded. "That answer may come," she said, "but only if you survive long enough to understand the cost." She reached beside her and lifted a small clay bowl. Inside was a thick, dark liquid. Without explanation, she offered it to him. "Drink." Gaius hesitated. Then he took the bowl, raised it to his lips, and drank. The liquid was bitter and strange, thick like syrup with a metallic aftertaste. His stomach turned almost instantly, but he swallowed it all. The woman nodded, satisfied. "You'll rest now," she said, "and when you wake, you'll begin your work." "What kind of work?" he asked, his voice faint. But her image was already blurring. His vision swam, the torchlight smearing into long streaks of color. His body felt heavy, like stone sinking in water. He barely felt himself being lifted, carried through another corridor, placed on a cool slab of marble. The last thing he heard was the woman's voice, soft and far away. Sleep now, forgotten one. Rome has erased you, but we have not. He dreamt, or thought he dreamt. He saw shadows moving through the Senate hall, cloaked in black, faces hidden. He saw scrolls burned in quiet courtyards. He saw children running through alleyways, carrying messages no one else could read. He saw the emperor's statue cracking in the rain, a spider weaving a web between its eyes. And he saw himself, not as Gaius, but as something else, someone watching from behind the crowd, someone who knew the names of men long buried, someone who understood the cost of silence. When he woke, it was hard to tell how much time had passed. He was in a small room, no larger than a merchant's stall. There was a basin of water near his bed, a folded robe, and a piece of bread on a wooden tray. He sat up slowly, dizzy but alert. The man in the hood returned again, standing at the doorway. "You slept well," he said. Gaius didn't answer. He looked down at his hands. They felt the same, but something inside him had shifted, like a door he didn't know existed had opened in his mind. "What now?" he asked. "Now you begin the path of the unseen," the man said. "We are the ones who remember what Rome wants to forget. We're the ones who speak when others are silent." He handed Gaius a folded piece of cloth. "Put this on, and follow me. There's something you need to see." Gaius dressed quickly. The robe was simple, dyed a faded red, the color of rust or dry blood. He followed the man through another passage, this one leading to a vast chamber lit by dozens of lamps. The ceiling was high, supported by stone arches. At the far end, a wall was covered in names. Hundreds of them, etched into the stone in tiny, perfect letters. Gaius stepped closer, his eyes scanning the names. Some were familiar: senators, generals, writers, even emperors. "These are the erased," the man said behind him. "Not criminals. Not all. Many were simply inconvenient. Too wise. Too honest. Too close to something Rome didn't want known." Gaius turned. "Then why remember them here?" "Because history lies," the man said. "But memory can be rescued." Gaius stared at the wall, the weight of it settling on him. Each name was a person, a life, a story that Rome had tried to silence. And now he stood among those who listened. "You're not a prisoner anymore," the man said softly. "You're a witness. One day, you may be the one to write the truth." Gaius didn't speak. Instead, he placed his hand gently on the wall where the names lived. And for the first time since he'd been condemned, he didn't feel alone. But far above, in the golden halls of power, a senator received a sealed message. A name was mentioned in the scroll, a name that shouldn't exist: Gaius. And just like that, the silence began to ripple. The past was not as buried as they had hoped. The senator who received the message sat alone in a candlelit room, deep within the Curia Julia, the great Senate house of Rome. His name was Publius Rutilius Falco, an old man with white-streaked hair and a reputation for caution. He had served under 4 emperors and outlived 2 of them. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded the parchment, not from age, but from the weight of what was written. The message was short. No seal, no official signature, just a few words scribbled in tight, fast ink. Asterisk Gaius Livius Vero walks the shadows. He remembers what you buried. Asterisk. Falco stared at the name. It was impossible. That name had been struck from all records. The man himself had been delivered for final judgment weeks ago. No trial, no appeal. The Senate had voted in silence. The punishment carried out in secrecy. There should have been no trace of Gaius left. But someone remembered. Falco stood slowly and walked to the window. The city below glowed faintly under the early moonlight. Merchants were closing up their stalls. Slaves swept the last dust from the streets. Rome looked peaceful, but Falco knew better. Rome was never still. Beneath its temples and markets, it stirred with secrets. He turned back to the message and read it again. The handwriting, it was familiar, though he couldn't place it. Someone close. Someone who had access. That was what troubled him most. The real danger wasn't that Gaius might be alive. It was that someone knew he was supposed to be gone. Truly gone. That meant the web was unraveling. And if too many threads were pulled, even the oldest truths could surface again. Far below the Senate chambers, Gaius continued to adjust to his strange new life. The days passed without sunlight, marked only by the changing of torches and the arrival of food. The network he had joined did not call itself anything. There was no emblem, no oath. They were a quiet collective of scribes, old soldiers, and displaced minds, each with a reason for being forgotten. Some had once been wealthy. Others were once powerful. All of them had crossed an invisible line and lived to tell no one. Gaius found himself drawn to a man named Elias, an ex-legionary with scars across both arms and a voice so low it felt like gravel sliding down stone. Elias didn't speak often, but when he did, his words carried weight. He told Gaius of a governor in Britannia who vanished after refusing to send taxes back to Rome. He told him of a priestess from the Vestal Order who had discovered a scroll meant to be destroyed. And he told him about the red vaults, the hidden chambers under Rome used not for justice, but for silence. Truth, Elias said one day, is like wine. If you store it too long in a sealed jar, it will either grow stronger or explode. Gaius had begun copying scrolls in the archive, documents that had been smuggled out of senatorial offices, imperial libraries, and even private homes. Most were fragments, notes from meetings, altered decrees, intercepted letters. Each one told part of a story Rome didn't want remembered. One scroll described changes to grain shipments redirected to private estates. Another exposed land seized from veterans and sold under false names. Each document was a thread, and the deeper Gaius read, the more he saw how carefully Rome had stitched its lies together. What unsettled him most was finding his own name, barely legible, scratched in the margin of a confiscated scroll. It was dated 2 months before his arrest. That meant the decision to silence him had come long before the charges. He hadn't betrayed anyone. He had simply known something they didn't want revealed. But what? He tried to remember every document he had handled in the grain office, every conversation in the Senate hallway, every strange look, every hurried step around him. Something he had seen or heard must have frightened the wrong people. And now he lived among the shadows, a man erased, trying to stitch his identity back together from whispers and ink. One night, as he worked by lamplight, a woman entered the archive. She was tall, with dark hair pulled tightly back and a sharpness in her posture that spoke of years in command. She wore no robe, no insignia, but the room fell quiet the moment she stepped in. Even Elias stood. She looked at Gaius. "Come with me." He followed without question. She led him down a passage he hadn't seen before, one that sloped downward and narrowed. The walls grew colder. The air turned damp. At last, they reached a locked iron gate. She produced a key from within her sleeve, turned it without speaking, and the gate creaked open. Inside was a chamber unlike any he had seen in the vaults. It was wide and round, lined with curved shelves full of scrolls bound in leather. A map of the Roman Empire, faded and hand-drawn, covered the far wall. Tiny red stones marked certain cities. Others were marked in black. "This is the core," she said. "These are the archives that can never be copied, never be carried out. What's here would shake the empire." Gaius stepped forward slowly, stunned by the sight. There were scrolls here from as far back as the founding of the Republic. Others were marked with imperial seals, some broken, others still intact. It was history, raw and unedited. She turned to him. "You want to know why they silenced you?" "Yes." She walked to one of the shelves and removed a scroll. It was marked with a symbol, 2 lines crossing over a circle. She handed it to him. Gaius unrolled it. The writing was faded but legible. It was a transport ledger. At first glance, nothing unusual. But then he saw it. An annotation near the bottom, in faint ink. Asterisk redirected per Senate order. Priority. Forum of Trajan reconstruction. Asterisk. He blinked. This wasn't grain for the people. It was tribute. Gold. And it had been rerouted. Not to the treasury, but to private vaults under the guise of a public project. It implicated 5 senators. One of them had sat beside him just weeks before his arrest. "You handled a copy of that once," she said, "and someone noticed. That's why they came for you." Gaius closed the scroll slowly. "They're still watching," she added. "Your name shouldn't be whispered again." but someone has whispered it, and that means the story isn't buried deep enough. He felt a chill in his chest. Someone in the Senate knows I'm alive. She nodded, and they won't stop until they're sure I'm not. She nodded again, eyes locked on his. Outside, Rome went about its daily rituals. Coins exchanged hands. Prayers rose from temples. Citizens dreamed of promotion and land. But in the belly of the city, a man who wasn't supposed to exist held in his hand the very thing that could unravel everything. And the silence above was beginning to tremble. Gaius stared down at the scroll in his hands, its weight suddenly feeling heavier than stone. It was just paper, just ink, but it held secrets powerful enough to change the future or destroy anyone who dared to speak them. He understood now. The punishment for treason in Rome wasn't always a result of disloyalty. Sometimes it was the cost of knowing something you were never supposed to see. The woman watched him closely. Her eyes were sharp, but not unkind. There was something in her expression, something like warning or maybe weariness. She had seen this moment before, many times in many faces. The moment someone realized they had been condemned not for what they did, but for what they could reveal. I didn't think it was important, Gaius said quietly, still looking at the scroll. It wasn't, until someone feared it might be, she replied. Fear shapes Rome more than law ever could. He slowly rolled the scroll back up and handed it to her. She took it without hesitation and returned it to its place on the shelf. The air in the room seemed thicker now, heavy with unsaid thoughts. What do I do with this knowledge? He asked. She gave a small, bitter smile. That depends on what kind of man you are now. I don't know, he admitted. It took everything from me. My name, my home, my life. Good, she said. Now you're free. He looked at her, confused. She turned away, walking slowly toward the faded map on the wall. Men with power are never truly free. They're chained to their ambition, to their titles, to their names. You have nothing left. That makes you dangerous. I never asked for this, he said. No one ever does, she replied without turning. But some still rise. Some take the pieces and make something new. The oil lamps flickered in the stillness. The shelves creaked softly, as though the scrolls themselves shifted in response to her words. She finally faced him again. You have a choice, Gaius, though that isn't your name anymore. You can disappear fully, sink into the silence, become a scribe, a watcher, one of us. Or she paused. You can return. He blinked. Return. She nodded. Above ground. A new face. A new name. Planted like a seed in the cracks of power. Learn what they know. Listen to what they whisper behind closed doors. And maybe, just maybe, help rebuild something better. Gaius felt his breath catch. The thought of returning to the surface, to walk freely in the streets, even in disguise, was like a dream. But it was also dangerous. If even a single person recognized him, the punishment would not be secret the second time. They'll kill me, he said softly. She stepped closer, her voice low. Yes, if they find you. But that's the cost of truth in Rome. You've seen what they do to men like you. What they fear most is not rebellion. It's exposure. He looked at the map on the wall, at the red and black stones marking cities, ports, and outposts. Each one held a name, a face, a story. How many of them had been erased like he had? How many had disappeared with no one left to tell their tale? He wasn't ready to decide. Not yet. But a seed had been planted inside him. It wasn't rage. It wasn't revenge. It was something quieter, more patient. The need to remember, to carry the truth, even if only in whispers. The woman touched his shoulder lightly. Rest tonight. Tomorrow, you'll begin training. Whether you choose the shadows or the fire, you'll need to learn how to move between them. He nodded slowly. She left without another word. He remained in the archive for a while longer, alone with the shelves, the silence, and the map of an empire built on fear. It was strange how a single error, a small annotation on a scroll, could unravel an entire life. And stranger still, how that very mistake might be the key to something far greater than he had ever imagined. When he finally returned to his quarters, the corridor was empty. A small lamp had been left burning in the corner. His cot was made. A folded tunic, plain and gray, lay on the bench. No more red robes. No more titles. Just simplicity. He lay down, but sleep didn't come quickly. His thoughts drifted between the past and the uncertain path ahead. He thought of the guards who led him into the vaults, of the torchlight flickering in the Senate halls, of the man who read his sentence without blinking. And he wondered how many of them had done this before. How many others had disappeared beneath Rome's polished surface? Outside, far above him, in the marble courtyards and tiled halls of the Palatine Hill, the city slept. But not everyone slept easily. In a quiet villa not far from the Temple of Vesta, the Senator Publius Rutilius Falco sat in his study, a second message now opened before him. It was unsigned, but the seal, a wolf's head pressed into dark wax, was familiar. It read, asterisk he remembers, and he is not alone, asterisk. Falco stood up, his hands trembling. Impossible, he whispered. We bury them all. But deep in his chest he knew the truth. Some stories do not stay buried, and some names, even when erased, continue to echo. Far beneath the city, Gaius, no longer Gaius, closed his eyes and listened to the stillness. Somewhere in that silence, he could almost hear it, the sound of history stirring. Sleep came in strange waves beneath Rome. There were no birds, no bells, no sounds of carts rolling through the streets to mark the hours. Down in the depths, time softened around the edges. Minutes bled into hours, and days passed without warning. Gaius, though he no longer carried that name, was slowly adjusting to this forgotten world. His body recovered, but his mind remained alert, watchful, waiting for the next step in a life that wasn't supposed to continue. Each morning, or what passed for morning in the vaults, he was led to a room lit by a single oil lamp. There he trained, not with swords or shields, but with words, scripts, and silence. The woman who had introduced him to the corps, whose name was never spoken aloud, oversaw his progress from a distance. He was given scrolls to copy, symbols to memorize, and histories to internalize, not the histories taught in the Senate or sung by poets, but the hidden ones, the stories behind the statues beneath the roads. He learned to read gestures, to notice the pauses in speech, to listen to what wasn't said. He was taught to blend in, to change posture in speech, to vanish into a crowd with nothing more than a shift in tone or a half step back. At night, he lay on his cot and repeated names under his breath, names of those Rome had tried to erase. Some he remembered, most he didn't, but the act of speaking them, even in whispers, gave them life. One name lingered with him more than the others, Julia Sabina, a name carved on the wall of the corps, her story marked with a red stone on the empire's vast map. She had once served as a translator in the eastern provinces. It was said she uncovered letters between a Roman commander and a Parthian diplomat, letters that hinted at a betrayal hidden within the upper ranks. When she brought the letters forward, they vanished, and she followed. The official record said she drowned during a river crossing, but the vault knew the truth. She had been silenced. One morning, as he read through a scroll detailing shipments of silver redirected from the provinces of Gaul, Elias approached him. The old soldier leaned against the stone doorway, arms crossed, his gaze heavy but not unkind. "You've been down here longer than most," Elias said. Gaius set the scroll down. "I didn't realize time moved so quickly." "It doesn't," Elias replied. "That's the danger of this place. If you're not careful, it makes you forget why you're here." Gaius nodded slowly. "And why are you here?" Elias chuckled, low and dry. "I followed orders once that I shouldn't have. Burn a village we were told housed traitors. Turned out to be a merchant town. Women, children. We were told afterward it was a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. A few of us spoke out, quietly. Next thing I knew, I was being questioned for disloyalty. I saw what was coming and disappeared before the sentence could be handed down." Silence settled between them for a moment. "You regret it?" Gaius asked. Elias shook his head. "I regret not speaking louder. I regret not making it impossible for them to lie about what happened. But disappearing saved my life, and maybe, in a way, gave it meaning." Gaius understood that now. The weight of silence, the power of memory. Later that day, the woman returned. She called him to the map room again, where the stones marked Rome's secret history. This time, she removed a small red stone from the western side of the map. Hispania. A senator's courier disappeared, she said. He carried documents that didn't belong in his hands. A witness claims he was taken by men in uniform. We suspect an unauthorized tribunal. Quiet execution. No trial. Do we know what the documents were? Gaius asked. She handed him a scroll. This one newer, still smelling faintly of wax and ink. It was a partial transcript of a message sent from the provincial capital, reporting land seizures near a mining town. The land, once owned by retired soldiers, was being claimed for imperial infrastructure, but the funds were missing, redirected, possibly forged, and the courier had been carrying evidence of it. They've started removing anyone who gets too close, she said. And you want me to find out who gave the order, he said. She nodded. You'll go above. New name, new identity. We'll plant you in a senator's household as a scribe. The words hit him hard. It was what he had once feared, and now, oddly, what he felt drawn toward. A return to the world that had cast him out. Not as Gaius, not as a citizen, but as an observer, a ghost. You're sure I'm ready? He asked. No, she said flatly. But no one ever is. Later that night, they gave him new clothes, simple, well-fitted, dyed a modest shade of blue. A forged identity scroll. A background. Lucius Calvus, orphan, educated in Capua, recommended to a minor senator's office for record-keeping. The man he would serve, Senator Quintus Nerva, had a reputation for caution and a tendency to keep his distance from larger scandals. But he also had ties to the treasury. Gaius, now Lucius, studied the documents carefully, committing every detail to memory. He shaved, changed his posture, softened his voice. By the next morning, even the guards who had brought him in might not have recognized him. He left through a passage that exited beneath a broken aqueduct outside the city's walls. The sun, when it finally struck his face, felt like fire. He hadn't realized how long it had been. The noise of carts, of people, of birds, it was overwhelming. Rome was alive in a way the vaults could never be, but was also sharp, watchful, ready to devour. He moved through the crowd like he belonged, and no one looked twice. Just another young scribe with a scroll case on his back and nowhere to be. But as he passed a statue near the forum, a statue of the emperor, newly built, polished in gold, he felt a chill. A man nearby, dressed in dark robes, turned and glanced at him. Their eyes met for only a moment. The man didn't speak, didn't react, but there was something in that glance. Recognition? Doubt? Gaius looked away and kept walking. But he couldn't shake the feeling. Somewhere above ground, the silence had already been disturbed. And in Rome, once the silence breaks, the storm is never far behind. Lucius Calvus. The name felt both foreign and familiar as Gaius moved through the polished marble corridors of Senator Quintus Nerva's villa. The senator's home was large but understated, a place designed for quiet influence rather than public grandeur. It sat near the edge of the Aventine Hill, its outer walls weathered but strong, its gardens tended with military precision. Nerva was a man who didn't waste words or attention on what he didn't control. That made him dangerous, but also predictable. Lucius, Gaius, had been placed in the senator's service as a record assistant. His job, officially, was to manage incoming scrolls, maintain a library of correspondence, and copy summaries for the senator's review. Unofficially, he was there to watch, to listen, to wait. He had been trained to fade into the background, and in Nerva's household, it was easy. The other servants barely noticed him after the first day. The senator's clerk, a wiry man named Flavius, gave curt instructions and asked few questions. The staff was used to keeping secrets, but not because of any conspiracy. They were simply afraid. Nerva rewarded silence more than service. It didn't take long for Gaius to sense the tension beneath the surface. At first glance, Nerva seemed disconnected from the larger political tide. But there were signs, notes from lesser senators, fragments of documents referencing land in Hispania, and one in particular that caught Gaius's attention, a partially burned letter addressed to a man known only as C. The letter mentioned redistribution of funds in preparation for compliance with the forum decree. That phrase again. He had seen it in the scroll they gave him in the vault. The Forum of Trajan Reconstruction. But that project had supposedly finished years ago. He began cross-referencing names mentioned in the correspondence, mapping out connections in his head. Senators with property near key silver mines. Relatives appointed to obscure provincial posts. There were patterns, but they were subtle, buried beneath layers of polite wording and official stamps. The truth didn't shout. It whispered from the margins. Late one evening, while Gaius was cataloging older scrolls in the villa's lower chambers, he heard voices through the thin stone walls. He paused, ears tuned to every syllable. Two men were speaking in low Latin, careful and clipped. Another courier vanished near Tarraco, one voice said. The reports are being suppressed, the second answered. The treasury knows. They're just hoping it goes unnoticed. And the vaults? They'll find out eventually. We're buying time. The voices faded. Footsteps retreated down a side corridor. Gaius stood still for a long moment. Then he returned to his work, but the words stayed with him. There was more than theft at play here. There were disappearances. People were being silenced, not for crimes, but for proximity to secrets. Elsewhere in the city, the senator Publius Falco remained restless. The anonymous messages kept arriving, never more than a line or two, never signed. Each one carried a weight of knowing, as if someone was standing just beyond the edge of the lamplight, watching. He has surfaced again. The scroll from Hispania was not destroyed. There are witnesses in your circle. Falco began his own quiet inquiries. He paid informants in the grain district. He ordered discreet visits to the records office. One day, a letter arrived with no wax seal at all, just folded, plain, and marked with ash on the edge. Inside, it listed 4 names. Gaius Livius Vero was among them. So was Julia Sabina. And beneath them, scrawled in smaller ink, was a 5th name, Lucius Calvus. Falco's pulse quickened. He had heard that name recently, muttered in passing by another senator. A new scribe. Sharp. Quiet. Too quiet. He sent a message to a man named Magnus, a retired centurion turned enforcer. Observe. Do not engage. If he is who I think he is, we must be certain before we act. Back at the villa, Gaius began noticing small changes. A young servant girl who once smiled at him now avoided eye contact. A guard lingered longer near the scribe chambers than before. Flavius, the head clerk, started checking his work twice. Something had shifted. He was being watched. At night, he reviewed every conversation, every glance, every misplaced scroll. He no longer trusted the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that came before a door slammed shut. One afternoon, a new scroll arrived from the imperial offices. It was marked urgent and sealed in crimson wax. Gaius was ordered to copy it immediately and prepare it for Senator Nerva's eyes. As he read it, his blood turned cold. The scroll detailed a new directive, an internal audit of all treasury transfers over the last 5 years, but not by imperial order. It was being spearheaded by a small council of senators working off-record. The audit was to be selective, surgical. Names were being investigated, and more importantly, certain names were being excluded. He recognized 2 of the names flagged for exclusion. Senators linked to the Forum Project and the disappearing shipments of silver. This wasn't a cleanup. It was a cover-up. He copied the scroll with perfect penmanship. No hesitation. But he kept the original tucked into the sleeve of his robe and replaced it with a near-exact duplicate that omitted the most telling phrase. He couldn't send a message to the vaults. It was too dangerous now. But he memorized the names. He committed them to thought like a soldier memorizes enemy positions. The next day, while walking through the forum under the pretense of delivering records to the census office, he passed by the same golden statue of the emperor. This time, he didn't just feel watched. A figure stepped into his path, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, arms crossed under a weather-worn cloak. "You're Lucius Calvus," the man said, not a question. Gaius didn't stop. "I am." The man's eyes narrowed. "You were in Hispania, weren't you?" Gaius didn't break stride. "Briefly." Census work. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I've heard you're very thorough. Gaius nodded once. I try to be. The man didn't follow. But Gaius knew then that the net had been cast. His name, his real one, was no longer buried. It was rising, and if it reached the wrong ears, his second chance at life would end just as quickly as the first. That night, he returned to the villa and found his cot turned down, his writing supplies freshly restocked, and a new robe folded neatly at the foot of the bed. A subtle message. Someone knew he was more than he claimed to be, and the silence around him was beginning to splinter. Still, he couldn't run. Not yet. The truth was buried deep, but he was getting closer to the core. And if he stopped now, he wouldn't just lose his life. He'd lose the only chance to expose the Empire's most dangerous lie. Gaius lay awake that night, staring at the wooden beams above his bed. Sleep refused to come. Every creak of the villa, every rustle of wind outside, every step in the hallway could be someone approaching his room with a blade or a summons. He had taken a risk, altering the scroll and keeping the original. He knew better than to think it would go unnoticed for long. But silence was no longer enough. Not when the truth was clawing its way back to the surface. By morning, he had made a decision. He dressed quickly, tucking the real scroll into a hidden fold beneath his tunic, and headed for the city under the pretense of retrieving records. The guards at the villa gates let him pass without question. He kept his pace steady, not fast enough to draw attention, but not slow enough to suggest hesitation. His destination wasn't the census office. It was a small apothecary tucked behind the meat markets near the Tiber. A nondescript building with faded shutters and the scent of dried herbs clinging to the doorway. It was a place once mentioned by Elias back in the vaults, a neutral zone, a place where messages could pass between the surface and the shadows. Inside, the shopkeeper barely looked up. She was a narrow woman with a long gray braid and calloused hands. Without a word, she handed him a bundle of wrapped laurel leaves and motioned toward the back room. He entered. The room was empty, lit by a single narrow window. He waited. After a few moments, a panel in the far wall creaked open, revealing a hidden stairwell. A man in a dark robe stepped out. Gaius didn't recognize him, but the man didn't ask questions. He simply held out his hand. Gaius gave him the scroll. The man turned it over once, nodded, and disappeared the same way he came. It was done. The core would know what he had found. But as Gaius stepped back into the main shop, something was wrong. The shopkeeper was no longer behind the counter. Her chair was overturned, a clay jar shattered on the floor. His breath caught. He turned and saw them. Two men stood at the door, dressed in togas too clean for commoners, with posture too rigid for civilians. One stepped forward, smiling politely. "You're Lucius Calvus," he said. Not a question. Gaius didn't respond. "We were told you'd be here. Senator Falco sent us. He'd like to speak with you." Falco. So the trap had already closed. "I'm just a scribe," Gaius said evenly. "I was picking up herbs for the household." The second man shook his head. "No, Gaius Livius Vero. You're not just a scribe." There it was. His real name. Spoken aloud. After all this time, Gaius didn't wait. He shoved past the men, sending one crashing into a barrel of dried figs, and sprinted into the street. People shouted as he darted between carts and oxen, his tunic flapping, heart pounding. He knew these streets well. He'd memorized them as part of his training. He turned sharply into a side alley, leapt over a low wall, ducked beneath a laundry line, and vanished into a tangle of side streets near the baths. He didn't stop running until he reached the southern edge of the Forum. There, hidden behind a columned facade near the ruins of an old temple, was another marker, an old marble lion with a chipped paw. He crouched beside it and pressed his hand to the base, feeling for the hidden latch. Click! A narrow door swung open behind the lion statue. He slipped through and descended into darkness. The air was cool and thick with dust. The tunnel twisted downward, deeper than even he remembered. At the bottom, a flickering torch revealed a familiar face. "Elias, you weren't followed?" the old soldier asked, voice rough. "Not that I know of," Gaius replied, breathless. "They know who I am now. Falco sent men. I had no choice. I passed him the scroll. It's already gone. Elias didn't seem surprised. He nodded and gestured for him to follow. They moved quickly through the passage, entering the vaulted halls of the core. The woman with the sharp eyes, still unnamed, was waiting. Others were already gathering. There was tension in the air. Quiet coiled. Gaius held up his hands. They said my name aloud. In the street. She looked at him carefully. Then the silence is broken. A hush fell over the room. It was Elias who spoke first. Do we scatter? The woman shook her head. No, we accelerate. She turned to Gaius. The scroll you delivered, it's already confirmed what we suspected. The theft was orchestrated at the highest levels. Funds were rerouted through false provinces. Entire populations displaced under the pretense of imperial projects. Gaius swallowed hard. And the ones who knew, most are dead, disappeared, or like you, erased. He stepped forward. Then we publish it. We send the scrolls to the people. Let Rome see the truth. The woman's expression turned grim. It's not that simple. Rome doesn't trust whispers. It trusts blood and spectacle. If we want people to listen, we need more than proof. We need a voice they can't ignore. She looked down at a small table. On it sat a list of names. One name was circled in red ink. Senator Falco, she said. He has enemies. Enough that if he were exposed, they'd tear him apart. But we need someone inside. Someone who can push him into the light. Gaius stared at the name. The man who tried to erase him. You wanted to go back, he said. The woman nodded. No one else has been that close. And he already suspects. That's why he'll make mistakes. If we can get him to confess, or even hint at what he's done, before his allies silence him, we can end this. Gaius felt the weight settle on his shoulders. I won't survive it, he said quietly. Elias stepped forward. Maybe not. But if you succeed, Rome might remember your name. And in that moment, Gaius knew, the story had never been about escaping punishment. It had always been about choosing what your punishment meant. Silence or truth. Erasure or memory. He took the list, folded it, and looked up. Then let's finish what they tried to bury. Gaius didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear. He had already passed beyond the reach of fear, but because his mind was crowded with voices from the past. The whispers of senators in marble halls, the dry voice of the hooded woman, the rumble of Elias' warnings. Somewhere along the way, the man named Gaius Livius Vero had died, not with a sword or poison, but in the quiet vanishing Rome inflicted on those who saw too much. And yet, here he was, reborn, not as a martyr, not as a hero, but as a witness who refused to forget. At dawn, the woman placed a scroll in his hands. The seal was simple, 2 overlapping crescents, an internal mark of the core. Inside was not a message, but a map, a route through the lower levels of the Curia Julia, through a disused servants' corridor that once allowed cooks and staff to move unnoticed beneath the Senate chambers. At the end of the map was a room. Small, hidden, echo-proofed. It was once used by scribes to eavesdrop on deliberations. Few remembered it even existed. You'll go tonight, she told him, her voice steady. Falco will be attending a meeting of the Praetorian Oversight Committee. He'll be speaking freely, arrogantly. We'll need you there to record every word. Gaius nodded, his fingers running along the edge of the parchment. It felt like a blade in his hands, quiet but dangerous. You won't be alone, Elias added. We'll have eyes near the chamber and runners ready to carry what you hear back to the vaults. But once you go in, there's no way out until the session ends. If you're discovered, they won't discover me, Gaius said, surprising even himself with the certainty in his voice. That evening, dressed again in the plain blue robe of a minor scribe, Gaius walked through the marketplace near the Capitoline Hill as the city dimmed beneath a pink sky. The torches were being lit one by one along the marble arcades. He passed through a side gate, where a sympathetic servant, one long loyal to the core, gave him access to the hidden corridor beneath the Senate. His path was lit only by a small wax lantern, its light dancing on the rough stones. He moved quickly, quietly. The tunnel grew narrower as it bent beneath the eastern wall of the Senate chamber. At the end, he found a chamber marked on the map, a low room with a curved ceiling, nearly silent. A narrow slit in the wall allowed sound to drift down from above. He sat, pulled out his small wax tablet and stylus, and waited. Voices came soon after, muffled at first, then clearer. Senator Falco, we've already taken care of the courier. There are no surviving copies of the scrolls from Hispania, at least none that can be traced to this chamber. The funds are where they need to be, and the governor will keep quiet so long as we deliver the next shipment on time. Another voice, sharp and impatient. And what of the grain? The people are restless. We can't redirect provincial resources again without notice. Falco replied, almost casually, let them be restless. Bread riots are easier to silence than whistleblowers. A low chuckle from someone else. Gaius's hands moved fast, recording every name, every phrase. He didn't blink, didn't breathe deeply. He simply listened. Words that would never appear in official records. Confessions buried beneath gold-trimmed togas. The real Rome, the one made of fear, greed, and survival, was revealing itself. Then something unexpected. A pause in the conversation. And Falco's voice again, lower now, slower. There's a name resurfacing. A mistake we thought buried. Gaius Livius Vero. Gaius froze. Falco continued. He should have died in the vaults. But someone pulled him out. Someone with influence beyond our reach. Do you think he knows? Another asked. I think he remembers, Falco said. And I think he's already among us. Silence. Then the voice added coldly. Then we must find him and finish what we started. A door opened above. Footsteps. The meeting was ending. Gaius waited until the sounds of the Senate chamber had faded completely before standing. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what he had just captured. He retraced his steps in the dark, lantern shielded, heart pounding. At the edge of the passageway, near the lion statue, he found a runner waiting. A boy no older than 15, eyes wide, breath fast. Did you get it? The boy asked. Gaius handed him the tablet and nodded. Run, he whispered. Take it to the core. Tell them they have what they need. The boy nodded and vanished into the alley. Gaius didn't go back to the vaults. He couldn't. Not yet. His name was too close to being spoken aloud in public spaces. He melted into the crowd, heading toward the slums beyond the Aventine, where he could disappear again, at least for a night. But by morning, everything had changed. The core acted quickly. The tablet Gaius had written was copied and duplicated. Several runners carried the copies to the temples, to scribes, to market stall preachers, to the walls of the forum itself. By midday, the truth was on display for all of Rome to see. Senators named, funds stolen, lives silenced, betrayal exposed. Crowds gathered around the parchment nailed to the temple walls. Citizens read in shock, others in fury. Murmurs turned to chants, chants to cries. And in the Curia Julia, the Senate was thrown into chaos. Falco denied everything, called the scroll a forgery. But too many had read it. Too many recognized the style, the names, the phrases he'd once whispered in safety. The other senators began to withdraw, to whisper about self-preservation, to distance themselves from a man they once followed. Within hours, Falco was under house arrest. By evening, the emperor's own advisors had issued a quiet decree. A full investigation would begin. Back in the vaults, the woman and Elias waited for Gaius, but he didn't return that night. He was still out there, walking among the people, not as a fugitive anymore, but as a witness. His name was still dangerous, but now it meant something again. Not a memory of betrayal, but a reminder of what survived when silence was broken. And in the shadows of the city that had once erased him, Gaius stood quietly, watching, listening, remembering. Rome had tried to bury him, but the truth always finds its way to the surface. For days, the city didn't sleep. The scroll posted on the temple wall spread like wildfire. Scribes made copies. Readers stood in silence, murmuring through each line as if reading a funeral notice. Others didn't read at all. They only needed to hear the names. Senator Falco's name echoed in taverns and bathhouses, on merchant steps and crowded forums. He had been too careful for too long, too powerful for too many years. Now, Even the way he walked seemed suspicious. People who once nodded in respect now looked away. Some spat at the ground after he passed. But even as Rome stirred with unease, something darker brewed underneath. The core had struck first, but it wasn't over. And Gaius knew it. He didn't return to the vaults, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. The core needed to remain hidden, and his presence now was too risky. He stayed in motion, changing locations each night. Sometimes he slept in crowded inns where no one asked questions. Other nights, he hid in the ruins outside the city, curled under a tattered cloak, listening to the wind drag dust through old stone archways. The city was on edge, but Gaius was more focused than ever. He knew Falco wouldn't fall quietly. In fact, something was already shifting. Whispers of discontent weren't just coming from citizens. They were coming from the palace gates. Imperial guards had been seen escorting high-ranking men into closed-door meetings. Some of the emperor's advisors were strangely silent, their usual routines disrupted. A Praetorian guard had been found unconscious behind the census hall. No witnesses, no report filed. Another courier disappeared. Too many signs for coincidence. Gaius moved carefully, but everywhere he turned, he felt the pressure mounting. One night, while crossing a quiet bridge near the edge of the Aventine, he heard footsteps behind him. He stopped, half expecting a passerby. But the footsteps stopped too. He turned, saw nothing in the darkness, and then continued walking. This time, no steps followed, but the silence felt worse. He quickened his pace, turned down a narrow street, and ducked into an alley he knew led to the back of a bakery. But as soon as he turned the corner, two men stepped into view, both cloaked, faces in shadow. One blocked the path ahead. The other closed the way behind. No weapons drawn yet, but their posture was clear. "You've made quite a mess," the man in front said. Gaius didn't answer. "You thought dragging Falco's name into the light would stop this?" the second man asked. "You don't understand how deep it goes." The first man stepped closer. "You were supposed to disappear. That was the deal. But now, even the emperor is asking questions." Gaius stood still, hands at his sides. "So, you're here to clean up the mess?" "Not yet," one said. "Not until we know how much you still know, and who you've spoken to." "I've spoken to everyone," Gaius said. "That's the problem, isn't it?" The man in front stopped walking. His tone changed. "You still don't get it. You're not the only one who was supposed to stay buried." That hit Gaius. These men weren't Falco's. They were someone else's, possibly even from the palace. And if they were here now, it meant the truth had shaken loose something much bigger than one senator. He moved quickly, ducking left, throwing his shoulder into a crate of broken amphory, sending it crashing to the ground. The men lunged, but he was already sprinting through a side passage, leaping over a low wall, vanishing into the shadows of a nearby courtyard. He didn't stop running until he reached the river, where he collapsed behind a pillar, gasping for breath. They weren't chasing him anymore, but they knew he was alive. And more importantly, they knew he still had more to say. That same night, in a hidden chamber beneath the forum, Elias met with the woman from the core. Her usually calm voice was tight. "There are rumors from the palace," she said. "The emperor's own scribes are under quiet investigation. Messages are disappearing. Whole record rooms sealed." Elias frowned. Falco was never the final target. "No," she said. "He was the first." They knew now that the corruption stretched beyond a few senators. It wove through the city's highest circles, bending policies, shifting fortunes, deciding who would rise and who would vanish. But the most dangerous part wasn't what had already happened. It was what was about to. The next day, another scroll appeared. This one not nailed to a wall, but slipped into the folds of robes, tucked into market baskets, handed to stable boys and shopkeepers. It was a list. Names, dates, transactions, all linked to a new project, one that hadn't yet begun. A proposal to build a new imperial granary. On the surface, it sounded noble. Feed the poor, restore order, give jobs. But Gaius recognized the names attached. The same ones from the Forum of Trajan's scheme. They were trying again. This time, under the emperor's name. Only now, the stakes were higher. And Gaius was no longer a hidden observer. He was the loose thread, and Rome was pulling at him with everything it had. The city was teetering on the edge of something it had never faced before. Not a riot, not a war, but a reckoning. And in the shadows beneath its marble halls, the final move was already being planned. The morning after the scroll with the granary proposal began to circulate, the city shifted again. People didn't speak of it openly in the forums or at the fountains, but the change could be felt in the glances shared between merchants, in the tension clinging to the air like mist before storm. Rome had always been loud, clanging carts, shouting vendors, horses clopping over stone. But now, silence crept in. Uneasy, watchful. The people of Rome weren't just reading names anymore. They were remembering them. And Gaius had become one of them, even if most didn't know it yet. He moved through the city unnoticed, just another tired man in simple robes with a satchel and a limp from running too long and too far. But he was carrying more than parchment or secrets now. He carried the weight of the next choice. The granary project wasn't just a continuation. It was proof that even exposure wasn't enough to stop the machine. If anything, the machine had learned to rebuild faster, to hide deeper. He made his way back to the outskirts of the Aventine, to a cramped bakery cellar where he knew the core had left an emergency signal. 3 black dots painted on the bottom of a clay amphora. It was there, freshly painted. It meant a meeting had been called. At nightfall, he followed the hidden tunnel behind the apothecary again. Inside the vault, fewer people were speaking. The mood wasn't defeat. It was something colder, strategic, focused. Elias met him near the archive shelves. His face was drawn tight. "You saw the new scroll," Elias said. "It's spreading quickly." Gaius nodded. "It's the same names. New face. The difference is," Elias said, "this one was signed by the emperor himself." Gaius stilled. "Not a proxy?" he asked. "No," said the woman, emerging from the side corridor. "It bears the seal of the imperial office. The grain project is real. The contracts are already being awarded. The money is moving again." "Then we were too late?" Gaius asked. "No," she said, her eyes fixed on him. "We're just on time. But this time we don't leak. This time we confront." Gaius didn't immediately understand. "You mean publicly?" She nodded. "Openly. With names. With evidence. With you." Silence hung in the stone chamber. "You want me to speak?" Gaius asked. "They'll kill me before I finish the first sentence." "Maybe," Elias said. "Or maybe it will be too late for them to silence you." The woman stepped closer. "You're not a whisper anymore, Gaius. You're a reckoning." It was madness, or courage, or both. Gaius couldn't tell the difference anymore. But something inside him, a spark that had long lain buried, began to stir. He had spoken in whispers, listened in shadows, sent truths into the world like silent arrows. But he'd never stood in front of the people and said it out loud. The empire was built to crush men like him. And yet it had failed. That night the plan was drawn. 2 days later, during the weekly address in the forum, the one where junior senators spoke to the citizens about public plans and imperial projects, a space would be cleared, a platform erected, a distraction arranged, and then Gaius would take the stage. The core would be scattered throughout the crowd, ready to protect, to document, to shout his words louder than any single voice could. It was bold. It was desperate. It was their only chance. The night before, Gaius wrote his words by candlelight. Not a speech, exactly. More like a confession. He didn't write like a senator. He didn't speak like a noble. He wrote plainly, as a man who had been erased and had come back with his memory intact. A man who had seen the empire from below its feet and lived to describe the cracks in the marble. At dawn, he walked toward the forum. His robe was darker now, his hair cropped shorter. He looked like a servant, a runner, a man beneath notice. But his scroll was ready. The forum was crowded. The city had been promised news about the emperor's new grain program. A junior senator was expected to speak, followed by a mid-level magistrate from Hispania. Gaius waited behind the marble columns, listening as the officials began their careful declarations. Then the cue came. A small crash, nothing serious. Just a cart tipping over on the far side of the forum. It drew attention. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and then Gaius stepped onto the platform. He didn't shout. He simply unrolled the scroll and began to read. "My name," he said, "was once Gaius Livius Vero." Gasps. One voice in the crowd cried out, "He's dead." "I was erased," Gaius continued. "Not by law, not by justice, but by silence. I was condemned not for treason, but for asking where the silver had gone." The guards noticed too late. He raised the scroll higher and kept reading. He listed the names, the redirected funds, the erased couriers, the land stolen from citizens under the name of imperial progress. "Rome," he said, "is not dying from enemies. It is rotting from secrets." People pushed forward, not to silence him, but to hear him better. The senator in charge of the platform tried to interrupt, but was drowned out by the crowd shouting, "Let him speak." Gaius's voice never rose above normal, but the silence he had broken in the vaults was now echoing across the forum. He ended with a question. "If a man like me, erased and forgotten, can remember the truth, why do you let yourselves forget it?" The crowd was still. The guards surged forward, but they were slowed by citizens, not with violence, but with bodies standing in the way, hands raised, voices rising. "Let him go. He's right. Where's our silver? Where's our bread?" By the time the guards reached the platform, Gaius was gone. The corps had pulled him out, slipping him into the crowd through a side path, cloaked and hooded. He vanished into the city once again. But this time, he had left something behind. His name, his voice, his truth. And in the Senate the next morning, there were no speeches. Only fear, because a man who had been buried had risen in front of the people, and Rome could no longer pretend it didn't hear him. In the days after Gaius vanished from the forum, his name became more than just a whisper. People began repeating his words in private homes, then at bakeries, then openly in front of the temples. His quiet courage had stirred something old in the people, something Rome hadn't felt in years: defiance. Scrolls with portions of his speech were copied and left on benches, stuffed into baskets, handed to strangers. The phrase "Rome is rotting from secrets" was carved into walls in charcoal. Guards tried to scrub them off, but they reappeared overnight. Behind the closed doors of the Senate, panic spread like fire in dry fields. Senator Falco, though now under house arrest, was still well connected, and it was through one of his surviving messengers that a single line reached the ears of those who had remained silent too long. Asterisk, he was never working alone. Asterisk, that was the second blow. Until now, Gaius had been treated as a lone rebel. Damaged, yes, but contained. But now, the Senate began to suspect something worse, that there was a network, an organized group with scrolls, copies, safe routes, and strategy. The very idea terrified them. It meant every scribe, every servant, every delivery boy could be watching, reporting, waiting. And then the real twist came. 2 nights after Gaius's public appearance, a document was discovered in the Imperial Library. It was hidden inside a hollowed-out binding of an old census log. The discovery was made by accident. A young assistant archivist named Linus knocked it off the shelf. Inside was a scroll sealed with the mark of the Imperial Treasury. What was inside stunned the palace. It wasn't just proof of corruption. It was a record of an order, signed, dated, and coded, from nearly 6 years prior. It authorized the sudden reallocation of emergency relief funds from Hispania to what was called urban stability measures. But what caught everyone's attention was the final signature. It wasn't Falco's. It was the emperor's steward, the right hand of the ruler himself, which meant the emperor may have known, or worse, approved. Word didn't spread to the public immediately. The steward was placed under protective isolation in the palace, and whispers of betrayal began crawling up the walls of power. The problem was no longer just Falco. The corps' accusation had now bled directly into the imperial court. Gaius, hidden once again in the outer districts, learned of this development through a bread merchant. The man passed him a folded note inside a loaf. A childish method, but one that had kept secrets alive. The note read simply, asterisk, they found the steward scroll. It's bigger than we thought. They're coming for all of us now. Asterisk, that changed everything. Because now, Rome's punishment for treason wouldn't be aimed at one man. It would turn on everyone who listened, everyone who repeated the speech, everyone who believed him. The next morning, imperial messengers posted a new decree in the forum. Any citizen found spreading seditious or falsified record would be subject to public disciplinary action. It was an old phrase, but everyone knew what it meant. They were bringing back public punishments. Spectacles, not trials. Examples. The city turned tense again. Scrolls stopped appearing. Walls stayed clean. Faces turned away. Even the street singers fell quiet. Rome had survived plagues, invasions, and fire, but it always feared its own silence the most. Gaius didn't run. He stayed close to the city, constantly changing disguise. He knew they would hunt for the core now, not to question them, but to destroy their records before more truth surfaced. And that's when the second twist revealed its teeth. The core wasn't just in the vaults anymore. In the years they had survived underground, they had built a second network, hidden inside the palace itself. Former slaves, displaced scholars, servants, scribes. They had passed information for years, unnoticed. In one of them, a quiet woman named Sabella, who worked in the emperor's archive, had kept a copy of every controversial directive she'd ever filed. Gaius had never met her, but now her name was whispered to him with urgency. She had something more, not just the steward's records, but letters, personal letters, between Falco and a man only referred to as a Severus. The name didn't appear in any Senate scrolls, but to those who studied the empire's shadowed corners, it rang like a gong. Aulus Severus was a fixer. He didn't exist on paper, but his presence haunted the empire's darkest decisions. He was known only by effects, quiet purges, vanishing messengers, retracted laws. If Severus was connected to the corruption, then it meant this wasn't just about stolen silver or a failed granary. It was about control. Sabella had been hiding these letters for months, unsure who to trust. But after Gaius's speech, she sent word she would deliver them, but only in person. Gaius agreed to meet her at a warehouse near the edge of the Trastevere district. It was neutral ground, too far from the palace, too poor for the Senate, too overlooked for the guards to care. But when he arrived, the warehouse was empty, except for one thing, the smell of burning parchment. He ran inside and saw the fire still smoldering. A pile of scrolls blackened at the edges. Sabella was gone, but not everything had burned. Half melted among the ashes was a wax seal, the crescent mark of the core. Someone had betrayed them. Someone inside the core was working with the palace, feeding information, undermining every move from within. Gaius stared at the ashes. It wasn't just about the empire anymore. The truth had enemies on both sides, and now he was standing between them. Gaius crouched beside the pile of ash, the scent of scorched parchment thick in the air, and let the silence speak. The flames had done their work, but not perfectly. A few pieces of hardened wax, charred scroll rims, and ribbon fragments remained. The letters from Sabella were gone, or most of them, but the betrayal was undeniable. Someone inside the core had tipped off the palace. The trust they had built, forged slowly in the dark across years of secrets, had cracked wide open. He pocketed the seal fragment, careful not to leave fingerprints, and stepped back into the night. He kept his hood low as he moved through Trastevere's narrow alleys, a city within a city where the poor clung to what Rome refused to feed. No guards patrolled these streets. Here, news traveled not through scrolls, but whispered exchanges, shared bread, and nods at street corners. And tonight, those whispers had shifted again. He stopped at a small tavern built into the side of an old warehouse. A painted fresco of a lion covered its crumbling outer wall, long faded, now nearly invisible in the dark. Inside, the woman with sharp eyes sat alone at a table, a cup of watered wine before her. "You heard," Gaius said quietly as he slid into the seat across from her. "I heard," she answered, not looking up. "Sabella's gone." Gaius placed the wax fragment on the table. She stared at it for a long time, then closed her eyes. "There were only 6 people who knew about that meeting," she whispered, "including me, and Elias." He felt a sharp chill run down his arms. "You think he's the one?" I don't know, she said, but I trust fewer people by the hour. Gaius leaned in. They want to pin this on us. Not just me anymore. All of us. They'll let Falco rot in his villa and claim it was an isolated corruption. The steward will disappear quietly. The grain project will be rebranded. They'll buy themselves time. Enough to erase the evidence, find every name on the scrolls, and make us disappear one by one. And if we go public again? She asked. They're not afraid of scrolls anymore, Gaius said bitterly. They're afraid of memory. She looked up then. So we make them remember. He paused. Ow! She pulled a small leather pouch from beneath her cloak and spilled its contents onto the table. Inside were 4 small metal tokens, each stamped with an imperial eagle and etched with different letters. At first, Gaius didn't understand. These are temple offerings, she said. Each one corresponds to a different district's shrine. He looked at her. These shrines, she said slowly, are watched, listened to, even by palace agents. They're considered safe places for confession, for prayer. And during the Festival of Concordia next week, thousands of citizens will pass through them. Gaius felt the idea taking shape even before she finished. We place the truth in the prayers, she said. The real prayers. The ones that won't be burned or erased. The ones whispered into the stone. His mind raced. You mean, instead of posting scrolls, we let the people carry the words themselves. A hidden archive, not on walls or in temples, but in memory, in repetition, quiet, dangerous repetition. He nodded. It's dangerous. So is silence. They met with 2 others the next morning. Messengers who had remained loyal. One of them a former slave who had memorized entire scrolls in his youth to relay them by speech alone. They began creating coded verses, short enough to be remembered, specific enough to carry the names and crimes in plain sight. Instead of Falco stole from the treasury, it became asterisk, falcons carried silver past the city's gate, and the lions stood still. Asterisk, instead of the steward forged the seal, it became asterisk, the hands that feed the palace feast turn the emperor's bread sour. Asterisk, verses, phrases, riddles. They were passed hand to hand, like prayers, and whispered at shrines across the city. And the city listened. Old women repeated them to one another at the water wells. Bakers etched them into the flour on loaves. Children sang them like games, skipping to the rhythm. Each version grew stronger as it spread, harder to trace, harder to silence. One night, Gaius passed through a quiet street where a blind musician played a lyre. The man's fingers moved slowly, his voice cracked with age, but Gaius froze when he heard the lyrics. Asterisk, the lions of the Senate drank from poisoned wells, while sparrows vanished from the sky. Asterisk, he hadn't written that verse. Someone else had added to the archive. It was spreading, but so was the danger. Elias returned to the vaults 2 days later. His beard was shorter, his expression grim. Gaius met him in the side chamber and watched as the older man looked around, eyes searching every shadow. We've lost the southern route, Elias said quietly. One of our runners was taken. He didn't talk, but they know enough to start purging the inner districts. That means they're hunting from inside now. Sabella, Gaius asked. Elias didn't answer, but then he turned and said, You know they'll eventually stop chasing shadows. They'll come for you. I'm ready, Gaius said, but not until the truth reaches the palace. Elias hesitated. You have something planned? We all do, Gaius said. This ends at the next Concordia festival. In the open. No scrolls. No walls. Just voices. Then they'll make examples of us. Maybe, Gaius whispered, but they'll do it in front of a city that remembers our names. Elias stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. You've changed, Gaius. You're not the boy I met in Hispania. I died there, Gaius said. I've been learning how to live ever since. As the day of Concordia approached, the city grew louder again, not with rebellion, but with rhythm, with coded songs and whispered truths disguised as prayers. The shrines became crowded, not just with citizens, but with guards trying to decipher the verses before they spread. But it was too late. Rome was listening, and in its silence, a new story was beginning to rise. a story not written by the Senate or sealed by emperors, but by those who remembered, those who whispered, those who refused to be erased. The morning of the festival arrived under a gray, trembling sky. For the first time in years, Rome felt unsettled, not from war or plague, but from something quieter and deeper. The people were waking up with questions they weren't supposed to ask, and the Senate could feel it in the air. More guards had been stationed at every shrine. At the Forum, imperial banners had been freshly hung. The grain project had been renamed the People's Harvest. Scrolls had been handed out at the entrances with messages about unity and trust. But it was too polished, too rehearsed. The crowd wasn't moved. They were watching, waiting. Gaius moved through the crowd in a worn cloak, head down. He wasn't hiding anymore, but he still knew better than to make himself obvious. This wasn't about him being seen. It was about being heard. The city had been prepared. The messages passed. The riddles memorized. The archive, if it could be called that, now lived in the people's mouths. It was living history, and today it would either bloom or burn. At the Temple of Concordia, a large gathering had formed. Priests began their speeches, carefully chosen words about order, legacy, and loyalty. Then came the imperial representative, a man named Marcellus, well-dressed, voice practiced. He spoke about progress, about the granary, about Rome feeding its own. The people listened, but they didn't cheer. They didn't nod. And then it began. An old woman near the front began to hum. A child picked up the rhythm. A man behind them echoed a line like a prayer. Falcons carried silver past the city's gate. A few turned their heads. Another voice added the next part. And the lions stood still. The guards moved toward them, but more voices joined. A verse at the shrine down the hill. Another across the road. Then dozens. Then hundreds. The phrases echoed. Words that were once coded were now chanted clearly. The hands that fed the palace feast turned the emperor's bread sour. It spread like a wave. Not violent. Not chaotic. Just sure. Collective. Remembered. Gaius stood among them, his chest heavy, his throat tight. For the first time, Rome remembered. But the twist came not from the crowd, who stood strong, but from the Forum steps. Senator Falco stepped forward. He was flanked by guards, not as their prisoner, but under escort. His face looked pale, but not weak. His voice rang out. "I have something to say." The crowd quieted. Falco held up a scroll. "This," he began, "is what you've all been waiting for. Proof. Confession. Betrayal." He paused, unrolling it slowly. "But it's not for me." There was a rustle in the crowd. "It was left in my quarters last night," Falco continued, "by someone who wants Rome to look one way, while they move in the other." He read the scroll aloud. It named names. It exposed funding trails. But they were different, carefully altered. They pointed blame at lower magistrates, distant governors. Gaius's name wasn't mentioned. Neither was the steward's. The letters, twisted. It was a trap, a false truth designed to confuse, to delay, to divide. And for a moment, it worked. The people wavered. Was this the truth they'd waited for? Had the core lied? Had they been led by ghosts? But then, a voice rose from the edge of the temple. It was Sabella, alive. Her cloak pulled back, hair short now, eyes fierce. She stepped forward, scroll in hand. "I wrote the original letters," she shouted. "I saw them forged. I saw the names erased and replaced." She handed the scroll to a young boy beside her, one of the Corps' runners, who passed it into the crowd. Citizens began reading, comparing, watching the lies fall apart in real time. And then Falco made his final mistake. He turned toward the guards. "Arrest her." But no one moved. The lead guard lowered his weapon. "We serve Rome," he said flatly. "Not your paper." The crowd roared, not with anger, but relief. It was over. The Corps had survived. The truth had spread. And for the first time in years, the people chose to stand on the side of it. Falco was taken, not to the palace, but into custody by a neutral faction of the Senate, one still clinging to dignity. The steward vanished, but not into the shadows. He was arrested days later near the docks, trying to flee with a forged identity. The emperor never spoke publicly about the scandal, but the granary project was quietly dissolved, and the whispers stopped, or so it seemed. Because just when the city began to settle, a final twist arrived, quiet, unnoticed by most. Elias disappeared. Not captured, gone. And in his empty chamber, beneath a loose stone, the core found a sealed note. It contained no confession, only a line. Asterisk, the archive is deeper than we thought. Asterisk, and with it a single name, one they had never spoken aloud, one they thought was long dead. But it wasn't Gaius. It was someone else, someone still out there, watching, waiting. And so the story didn't end. It simply changed hands. The days that followed were strangely calm, like the breath between thunderclaps. Rome returned to its daily rhythms, vendors calling out prices, children darting between market stalls, priests mumbling prayers at sun-stained temples. But those who were paying attention noticed something had shifted. The core wasn't hiding anymore. Not entirely. They still met in shadows, still relied on whispers and runners. But their cause was no longer secret. They had earned their place, not in power, not in titles, but in the minds of the people. That was harder to erase. Gaius moved quietly through this new Rome, no longer hunted, yet never truly safe. Every alley could still carry a knife. Every familiar face could turn cold. But for the first time, he walked without regret. The voices he once feared losing had become the city's voice. And still, the note from Elias stayed in his mind. Asterisk, the archive is deeper than we thought. Asterisk, that single sentence had opened a door in his memory, a question he had tried to bury. Who was truly at the heart of all this? Not Falco, not the steward. They were tools, clever, dangerous, but replaceable. Elias had always hinted there were others, unseen hands guiding the structure of power behind the curtain. But the name left behind in the note was one Gaius hadn't heard in over 10 years. It was a name whispered only once before, during his first assignment in Hispania, before his downfall, before he was erased. Cassian, a historian, a philosopher, an archivist of rare power who had once served as the emperor's official record keeper. He vanished the same year a series of controversial reforms were suddenly passed without opposition. His name had been scrubbed from records, his writings banned. But Elias had once confided that Cassian was more than a scholar. He was the architect, Elias had said, of silence. He knew what to bury and how deep. Now, somehow, Cassian's name was back, and Gaius had to find out why. He began in the place few dared go, Rome's oldest records vault, hidden beneath the Temple of Saturn. The outer floors were accessible to public scribes and junior officials, but below the third level, access required imperial clearance. Gaius no longer had credentials, but he knew someone who did. Sabella. She met him behind a vineyard near the Appian Way, wearing a hood and cloak again. She looked tired but unafraid. "I read the note," she said as she approached. "You think Cassian's alive?" "I don't know," Gaius replied. But Elias believed it, or feared it. She frowned. "If that's true, it means the silence wasn't accidental. It was designed." He nodded. "And if someone designed it, they can still be controlling it." Together, they planned the infiltration. Sabella had access to the third level through her remaining network of scholars. Below that, they'd have to improvise. She had a token, an old copper medallion once given to Cassian's direct apprentices. It wouldn't open every door, but it might convince someone to look away at the right moment. They waited until just after sundown, when the temple guards began their shift change. The outer vaults were busy, scribes cataloging festival records, census rolls, and imperial edicts. Sabella walked confidently, scrolls in hand, nodding to those she passed. Gaius followed 2 steps behind, disguised as a junior assistant. At the stairwell to the restricted levels, a single guard stood watch. Sabella didn't speak. She simply held up the copper token. The man squinted at it, then at her, then stepped aside. They descended quickly. The lower vault was cold and silent. Rows upon rows of sealed boxes, wrapped scrolls, and faded tablets stretched into darkness. Gaius had only seen it once before, years ago, and even then only briefly. The deeper they went, the more the air felt thick, like breathing through history itself. Sabella moved with purpose, stopping before a sealed stone door marked with a faded insignia, a closed eye surrounded by 7 stars. She reached in her sleeve and pulled out a thin, iron key. "I stole this," she whispered, "from the steward's private chamber." She inserted it into the lock. With a groan of stone and rusted metal, the door opened. Inside was a narrow corridor lined with clay jars sealed with wax and heavy parchment scrolls bound with red ribbon. But it wasn't the records that caught Gaius's eye. It was the table in the center. A table still covered in dust, but recently disturbed. Someone had been here. Sabella moved toward the far wall, where a set of drawers had been left half open. She pulled out a scroll, its seal broken. Gaius stepped beside her and read the header. Asterisk operative correspondence. C. Cassianus to A. Severus. Asterisk. His chest tightened. The scroll wasn't just proof that Cassian was alive. It was evidence that he had been orchestrating events from the shadows with Severus. Not decades ago, recently. Gaius read the first lines aloud. Asterisk. Ensure the disappearance of the steward's alternate ledgers. Have the grain project redirected through the northern district to avoid scrutiny. The boy is still alive. He remembers. Do not underestimate him. Asterisk. Sabella turned to him slowly. They were watching you from the start. He nodded, stunned. Before the arrest. Before Hispania. Before the vault. The scroll ended with one line. Asterisk. If exposure becomes inevitable, prepare the contingency in Alexandria. Asterisk. Sabella whispered. They have another plan. Far away. Far worse. A soft click echoed from behind them. They turned. A shadow stepped through the open stone door. A figure in gray robes. Older. Taller. With eyes that didn't blink. I was hoping the token wouldn't work, the man said calmly. Cassian. Alive. The architect of silence. And now, face to face with the one man Rome tried and failed to forget. For a moment, no one moved. The musty air of the archive, the damp stone underfoot, the flickering torchlight, none of it mattered now. Time had collapsed into this single instant, where Gaius found himself staring into the eyes of the man whose name had been buried deeper than any secret scroll. Cassian, the ghost in every sealed chamber, every erased name, every vanished courier. And here he was, in flesh and blood, older but unmistakably sharp. You should not be here, Cassian said, voice even, like he was reciting a lecture. But I knew, eventually, someone would try. Sabella tightened her grip on the scroll in her hand, stepping just slightly in front of Gaius. Why? Gaius asked quietly. Why all this? Cassian didn't flinch. He stepped closer, hands calm behind his back. Rome is not a place, he said. It's a balance, a myth held together by illusion. Too much truth too fast. It collapses. You killed people, Sabella said, barely containing her fury. You buried them alive in lies. You destroyed lives to protect your version of order. Cassian raised an eyebrow. And yet here we are, Rome still standing. You think this city survives by honesty? Gaius took a step forward. No, but it survives because people believe it can be better. You've spent your life making sure it never has the chance. Cassian tilted his head, almost amused. You've grown sharper, Gaius. When I had your name erased, you were still just a boy, asking questions without understanding their weight. Gaius's eyes narrowed. You were behind it? Cassian nodded. Of course. Falco and the others? They were clumsy, loud. But your questions, they were dangerous because they were quiet. Because you asked them with sincerity. And sincerity, he paused. That's harder to erase than ambition. Sabella's hand inched toward the dagger hidden under her cloak. Cassian saw it and didn't react. You think you can kill me and change Rome? He asked softly. You'll only bury the truth deeper. No, she said, but maybe we can make it louder. Cassian sighed. You already have. Look at what you've done. Chaos. Fear. The emperor no longer trusts his own stewards. The Senate is paralyzed. Grain shipments are halted. People are turning on each other. Do you think truth fixes that? Gaius didn't answer right away. He looked at the ancient records surrounding them, dust-covered stories no one had read in generations. I think the truth lets people finally choose what they want to become, he said. Not just what they're told to be. Cassian's eyes darkened. You're not the first idealist to say that. And like the others, you'll find that people don't want the burden of choosing. They want safety, illusion, certainty. Then let them choose illusion on their own, Gaius said. Don't force it on them. Cassian's lips curled into something between a frown and a smirk. It's already too late. What do you mean? Sabella asked. Cassian stepped to a nearby wall and lifted a latch hidden behind a cracked stone. A panel opened, revealing a small chest sealed in black wax. He opened it slowly and pulled out a scroll, one wrapped in gold ribbon. This, he said, is the contingency. Gaius reached for it, but Cassian held it back. Not yet, he said. You'll read it, of course. And when you do, you'll realize that while you've been focused on Falco, on the steward, even on me, something else has been moving. Quietly, carefully, Sabella stepped closer. What is it? Cassian looked at her, then at Gaius. For the first time, his voice lost its edge. A plan to create permanent silence, he said. One that doesn't rely on scrolls or guards, but on hunger. The two stared at him, confused. You've disrupted the grain lines. You exposed the fraud. Congratulations. But you've also set off a chain reaction. With every scroll you exposed, you slowed Rome's ability to feed itself. The palace will never admit it, but they've diverted food not to the poor, but to their allies. The eastern provinces will go hungry in weeks. The unrest will spread. And when it does, he let the words hang. Sabella paled. They'll blame us. Cassian nodded slowly. And then they'll unite. Under a new order. One built not from illusion, but from fear. He dropped the scroll into Gaius's hands. You win, Gaius. I'm done. Let the truth out. Let the city burn with it. He turned and walked toward the corridor, hands still behind his back. Gaius stood frozen, scroll in hand. Sabella's voice was quiet. He planned it all. Yes, Gaius said. Even his own end. They didn't follow him. By the time guards arrived hours later, Cassian was gone again, vanished into some other fold of the city. But the scroll remained. And when Gaius unrolled it, the truth hit like a storm. Cassian hadn't just tracked corruption. He had mapped it. Detailed records of every official tied to the grain system. Names, locations, alternate shipping routes, sabotage instructions, even letters drafted to blame core members by name. It was worse than Gaius imagined, and now it was all in his hands. They emerged from a vault into a different Rome. The crowd outside the temple square was tense. Word had spread. Fights at the bakeries, shortages near the river, merchant guards being hired in bulk. Sabella looked at him. What now? Gaius exhaled. The city waited. Not just for another speech, but for a decision. We give them the scroll, he said. Not through whisper or song. Not through riddles. Openly. We let the people see every name. Every plan. We publish it. Every word. Sabella hesitated. It could break the city. He nodded. Or save it. And in the distance, a bell began to toll. Not for a death, but for a reckoning that could no longer be stopped. The bell echoed over Rome like a warning. Deep, deliberate, and heavy with meaning. It wasn't one of celebration, nor the mournful toll for a fallen senator. It was the temple bell of Jupiter, a sound reserved for moments of civic emergency. And as it rang out that morning, people paused mid-step, mid-sentence, mid-breath. Even the pigeons that perched on statues seemed startled by the sound. Gaius and Sabella stood at the edge of the temple square, the golden ribbon scroll still in his hand, its weight now heavier than ever. It wasn't just a list of names. It was a time bomb. By noon, word had spread. A public reading was to take place in the forum. Not from the Senate, not from the palace, but from the people. For years, the truth had been passed in whispers. Now it would be shouted. Sabella moved quickly, alerting the remaining core members, smuggling out copies of the scroll to safe messengers and couriers. They would be dispersed in pairs, each carrying parts of the document to different districts, just in case someone tried to stop them. Gaius, meanwhile, returned to the same raised platform where he had once read his name aloud to the crowd. That day had felt like the peak of rebellion. But now, as he watched the square fill with faces, poor and wealthy, soldiers and scribes, old women and curious children, he realized that day had only been the beginning. The city was ready. He held the scroll in both hands, unrolled it slowly, and began to read. In the name of Rome, and in the memory of those who vanished without justice. His voice was clear. The air was still. Even the usual background chatter of the crowd fell away. This scroll contains the names of every official tied to the manipulated grain routes. Each one received compensation, favors, or silence in exchange for allowing shortages, starvation, and political gain. Gasps rose from the crowd. A name was read, then another, then another. As he read, some people turned pale. A woman cried out, recognizing a name from her district, a man who had promised aid and delivered none. A young man shouted curses when he heard the name of the magistrate who had seized his family's land. But Gaius didn't pause. He continued. He read letters, real ones, found in the vault. Letters from Cassian to Severus. Letters implicating others still in power. Letters that proved they had not only predicted the chaos, but encouraged it. One by one, the empire's secrets were laid bare. Not with drama, not with performance, just facts, truth, uncover at last. And then he read the final portion of the scroll, the contingency plan, the famine, the redirection of grain, the accusation strategy that would be used to blame the core and crush the uprising beneath the weight of public fear. That was when the crowd changed. They didn't just listen. They began to murmur. Then murmur turned to chants, and chants turned to action. Within an hour, people were walking out of their shops and homes, carrying empty bread baskets and worn-out ration slips. Not in anger, not yet, but in numbers. They flooded the lower forum, then the Capitol steps, then the Senate gate itself. The guard were unsure what to do. It wasn't a riot. It wasn't a mob. It was something in between, a rising. Sabella found Gaius shortly after, her cloak dusty, her eyes wide. They've surrounded the Ministry of Grain, she said, peacefully but completely. They're demanding that every ledger be opened. He nodded. They've earned that right. Cassian will vanish again, she said. You know that, don't you? Let him, Gaius replied. He's already lost the one thing he spent his life trying to control. Sabella gave a faint smile. Memory. He looked at her. Truth. By nightfall, the emperor's private council had been forced to respond. They sent an envoy, an aging senator known for his loyalty to the old order, to issue a statement. But the people refused to listen unless Gaius was there. So, for the first time in recorded history, a public citizen with no title, no rank, and a history of being legally erased stood beside an imperial envoy on the Capitol platform and responded directly. Gaius didn't deliver a speech. He simply read one final scroll, not a list of names, but of reforms, demands written by the people and for the people. Immediate redistribution of grain, public access to treasury records, a freeze on senatorial privileges until a formal inquiry was complete, and an open tribunal for the figures named in the Cassian archives. The senator's face was stone. This is not how the Republic operates, he said stiffly. Gaius replied. Then perhaps the Republic must remember what it was meant to be. The people erupted in applause. In the coming weeks, arrests were made. Not the usual kind, not theatrical scapegoats. Real officials. Several senators resigned quietly. The steward was sentenced. Falco was formally exiled, his name struck from the rolls. But Cassian was never found. Rumors placed him in Alexandria, or Carthage, or even deep in the provinces under a false name. But his silence remained intact. And yet, the archive was no longer his. It belonged to Rome now, written not in stone or scrolls, but in people, in stories, in song. Children played games based on riddles from the core. Bakers carved messages into loaves again. And on the first anniversary of the Great Revelation, the city held a public festival, not for a military victory or divine celebration, but for truth. Sabella stood beside Gaius that day as the crowd sang old chants, now joyous instead of fearful. She leaned toward him and said, "You never planned for this, did you?" He shook his head, smiling faintly. "I didn't even plan to survive." She laughed. "And now, he said, "we protect the archive." She looked puzzled. "I thought we already freed it." He turned to the crowd. "We did," he said. "But memory is fragile. It can fade, be rewritten, forgotten." Sabella nodded slowly. "So we remind them. Every day," he said. And as the sun set over the ancient rooftops of the city, Rome, for all its scars and sins, stood not in silence, but in song. Because the truth, once whispered, now lived in every voice. As the music of the festival drifted through the city's narrow streets and the torches burned into the evening sky, Gaius stood at the edge of the crowd, quietly watching. People were dancing in the open squares, not with grand celebration, but with something simpler, relief. It wasn't joy in the usual sense. It was the release that comes after a long silence, when words finally find their way back into the light. The city wasn't fixed. It wasn't perfect, but something important had shifted. Rome had spoken for itself. Not far from the Capitol steps, a group of children played with scraps of parchment and string, pretending to be messengers from the core. They shouted lines from the old riddles, pretending to deliver secrets from temple to temple. Gaius smiled faintly, knowing full well how dangerous those games would have been not long ago. Sabella joined him a moment later, handing him a piece of warm flatbread she'd picked up from a nearby vendor. For a second, they didn't speak. There was nothing left to strategize, no last scroll to hide or route to memorize. They had done what they set out to do, and now they were standing in the quiet after the storm. "Do you think he's still out there?" Sabella asked softly, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Cassian, I think he always will be," Gaius replied. "Men like him don't vanish. They simply change masks." Sabella looked thoughtful. "It's strange, isn't it, that after all this, we still don't know the full picture. We only pulled back one layer." "That's all we needed," Gaius said. "The people will pull the rest now." They walked together toward the lower forum, where elders had begun gathering around a public reading stone, one of the new changes the Senate had been forced to accept. Each week, citizens could post proposals, concerns, or findings. The stone became a kind of living journal. There were still risks, of course. Power doesn't give up easily. But the people had seen what was possible when truth was no longer silenced. That couldn't be taken back. A few days later, the city returned to its regular pulse. The markets reopened fully. Grain began to flow again, not in secret convoys, but in daylight, recorded and overseen by new, publicly elected stewards. The palace remained quiet on the matter. There were no speeches, no attempts to spin the story. Perhaps they thought it would pass more quickly that way. But the people didn't forget, and they didn't need permission to remember. Many of the core members faded back into their daily lives. Some returned to work under new names. Some left Rome entirely. Sabella stayed. She became a quiet teacher, working with scribes and young apprentices in the temple districts, helping them read the old records and ask better questions. She never mentioned the core by name again, but those who had been there understood. Her classroom always had one empty chair, just in case a voice from the past came seeking answers. Gaius stayed as well, though his presence became more like a shadow. He didn't seek recognition. In fact, many didn't know his face anymore, but they knew the name. His words had become part of the city's new vocabulary, quoted in passing, referenced in songs, carved discreetly into stones near the forum gates. He spent most of his days walking the outer districts, quietly listening to the people, making sure the silence never returned. One afternoon, as spring warmed the stone streets, a stranger approached him near the aqueducts. The man looked like a traveler, dusty boots, rough cloak, face half covered. He handed Gaius a folded note and said nothing before vanishing into the crowd. Gaius opened it slowly. Inside were just 3 words. Asterisk, he remembers too. Asterisk. There was no name, no seal, but Gaius understood. Somewhere out there, someone else had survived Cassian's network. Maybe another whistleblower. Maybe someone still loyal, now having second thoughts. The story hadn't ended. It had simply passed into another chapter. But Gaius didn't feel fear. He folded the note and placed it in his satchel alongside a few old parchment scraps and a worn ribbon that had once bound the final scroll. He looked out over the rooftops of Rome, listening to the wind move through the buildings, the faint laughter of children, and the quiet chatter of merchants preparing for the evening. This was a different city now. Not because it had purged corruption completely, not because power had vanished, but because people had found the courage to see it, name it, and speak against it. That was something Rome hadn't known in years. The punishment for treason had once been public and cruel, meant to scare people into silence. But now that fear had cracked. The punishment no longer worked because the people had chosen to stop fearing each other. What made it all matter wasn't the scrolls, or the names, or the exposure. It was the collective memory that had formed in the hearts of thousands. It was the quiet agreement that Rome's story wasn't finished, and no empire, no matter how powerful, could outlast truth forever. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the bells of evening prayer began to toll in the distance, Gaius turned back toward the city. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't a rebel. He was simply someone who had asked a question at the wrong time and lived long enough to hear the answer. He walked forward, blending into the rhythm of Rome once more, just one voice among many, carrying the echo of what had been uncovered and the hope of what still could be. And Rome, ancient and restless, kept listening.